first thing they noticed about Holt was the size of her hands. Not small, exactly, but not what anyone expected when a new sniper attachment showed up to a forward operating base in the Kandahar Basin in February. Sergeant First Class Devon Holt stood 5'4" in her boots, which were size 6, and she carried her rifle case the way someone carries something they've carried for 10,000 hours. Without thinking about it, without showing it. She set it down next to the briefing tent and signed the transfer paperwork, and nobody said anything to her face. They said things to each other. That was the first thing worth noting, not what they said. The fact that they waited until she was 3 steps away. Master Sergeant Pryce was the one who laughed first. He didn't try to hide it, which in some ways was worse than if he had. He had 17 years in, 2 combat deployments to Iraq and 1 to Mali, and he had the kind of confidence that comes from never once being wrong about something that mattered. He looked at Holt's rifle case, then at Holt, then at Staff Sergeant Emile Beaumont beside him, and he laughed the way men laugh when they think something is obvious. "They sent us a girl," he said. Beaumont didn't laugh, but he didn't say anything either. That was his own kind of answer. Holt heard it. She was meant to hear it. She picked up her case and walked to the accommodation block and unpacked her gear in the order she always unpacked it. Rifle first, optics second, cleaning kit third, everything else after. And she did not think about Pryce or Beaumont or any of the rest of them. She thought about the elevation data she'd reviewed on the transport flight and the wind pattern reports she'd requested 3 days before departure and not received, and she made a note to pull them herself once she had network access. She had learned, a long time ago, that there was only one effective response to being underestimated. It wasn't anger. It wasn't proving anything in the moment. It was simply being ready when the moment that mattered arrived. She didn't know yet how soon that would be. The task force had been operating out of Firebase Kestrel for 11 weeks when Holt arrived. It was a support element attached to a ranger battalion, and its job was reconnaissance and overwatch, which meant most of their days were spent waiting, and most of their nights were spent on hilltops watching things that didn't move. It was the kind of work that wore down men who needed action and suited men who could think, and the team had a specific culture that had calcified over those 11 weeks into something resistant to disruption. Holt was a disruption. It wasn't only that she was a woman, though that was part of it. It was that she had come in as a replacement for Corporal Yevich, who had gone home with a shattered kneecap and who everyone had liked. And it was that she had arrived with paperwork that listed her qualification scores, and those scores were in several categories, higher than anyone currently on the team. This last fact was not discussed out loud. It was the kind of fact that sits in a room and makes people uncomfortable without anyone naming it directly. The team leader was Captain Marc Lafleur, a Quebec-born officer who had spent 8 years with JTF-2 before a series of exchanges and secondments had landed him here, nominally embedded with American forces. He was not the kind of officer who made speeches. He had read Holt's file twice before she arrived and had said to Beaumont, when Beaumont raised his concerns, that the concerns would resolve themselves once the team saw her work. Beaumont had not looked convinced. Pryce had said nothing to Lafleur at all. He had simply increased the frequency with which he found small ways to make Holt's life harder. Not hazing, nothing that could be reported or named, just the particular friction of a team that had decided collectively that someone was not one of them. Her gear went missing from the staging area twice and reappeared without explanation. She was left off the rotation list for a briefing and found out about the briefing from a logistics officer who assumed she'd received the notification. The shower schedule, posted on the accommodation block wall, was updated, and she was not told. She noticed all of it. She said nothing. She adjusted. Lafleur noticed it too. He logged it in a personal notebook he kept, not in any official record. He was waiting to see if it would resolve itself. It was a gamble, and he knew it. The weather report that came in on the morning of the 14th day was the kind that should have stopped an operation. The mission had been planned for a week. A confirmed weapons cache had been located in a dry riverbed system 18 kilometers south of Kestrel, embedded in a series of rock outcroppings that made aerial observation unreliable and ground insertion the only practical option. Intelligence assessed the cache as likely guarded by a rotating element of 6 to 8 fighters, with a potential command figure present on a 48-hour cycle. The window for the command figure's presence was the current one. Holt had read the meteorological summaries for the region going back 30 days. She had cross-referenced them with a satellite imagery analysis she'd requested from a signals unit she'd worked with on a previous rotation. The pattern was clear to her, and she said so at the final briefing the night before insertion. The pressure gradient over the basin has been building for 72 hours, she said. We're looking at a high probability of a dust event beginning in the 6 to 9 hour window after insertion. Visibility could drop to under 50 meters across the entire operational area. She had brought the charts. She had them on a tablet, and she set the tablet on the briefing table, and she turned it so that Lafleur could see it clearly. Pryce looked at the charts for approximately 1 second. Weather reports in this region are wrong 40% of the time, he said, and we have a 48-hour window. If we wait it out, we miss the target. I'm not saying wait it out, Holt said. I'm saying we plan for the contingency. We always plan for contingencies. The contingency plan in the current brief assumes helicopter extraction is available. It won't be. Not in a dust event of this magnitude. There was a pause. Lafleur looked at the charts for longer than Pryce had. He looked at them the way someone looks at something they know they should act on and can feel themselves being pulled away from by the weight of momentum. We'll note the weather risk in the operations log, he said, and we'll review extraction options before we push. It was the kind of answer that meant, we're going anyway. Holt picked up her tablet. She did not argue further. She went back to her quarters and spent 2 hours updating her personal contingency planning, the kind that had no place in the official brief and existed only in her own preparation. She identified 3 potential overwatch positions that would be viable if the dust came early. She calculated the angles. She logged the wind compensation adjustments she would need if visibility dropped. She memorized all of it. She slept 4 hours. She woke before her alarm. They inserted at 0345. The riverbed system was exactly as described. A series of low sandstone ridges rising from the desert floor, folded and compressed into tight channels that would give cover to a small defensive element and make an approaching force easy to hear from 200 meters out. The team moved in a spread formation, Holt positioned as rear overwatch, which was the position Pryce had assigned her, and which she understood to mean, stay back, stay out of the way. She stayed back. She did not stay out of the way in the sense that mattered. She was watching everything. The cache site was reached at 0527. The intelligence assessment of 6 to 8 guards had been wrong. There were 11. Holt had counted them from a ridge 300 meters back. Using the night optics she had zeroed the previous afternoon while Beaumont and Pryce were eating dinner. She clicked twice on the radio, the signal for elevated threat count, and waited. Lafleur acknowledged. He adjusted the approach. The team held. At 0611, the command figure arrived. What happened next happened fast. A second vehicle, unaccounted for in the intelligence brief, came in from the south along a dry track that satellite imagery had shown as inactive. It carried 4 additional fighters, and in the moments of confusion that followed its arrival, someone on the team made a sound. A boot against loose rock, a cough suppressed half a second too late, and the position was compromised. The firefight started at 0614. Pryce was hit in the first exchange. Not badly. The round caught the plate carrier on his left side and cracked 2 ribs. But he went down, and the tactical picture changed in the seconds it took Beaumont to reach him. Lafleur called for immediate consolidation. The team pulled back into the channel using the ridgeline for cover, and the problem that became apparent within the first 4 minutes was the one Holt had been tracking since 0530. The sky to the west had changed color. Not dramatically. Not the way it looks in photographs. In the way it looks when you know what to look for. A particular ochre at the horizon, a texture in the upper atmosphere, a drop in ambient light that had nothing to do with cloud cover. She had seen it twice before, once in Jordan and once in Kuwait, and both times the wall had arrived faster than the meteorological models predicted. She clicked 3 times on the radio, the signal for immediate weather deterioration. Not now, Holt, Beaumont said. Look west, she said. There was a pause of approximately 6 seconds. Long enough, Lafleur, Beaumont said. We have a weather problem. The dust arrived at 0641, 22 minutes ahead of the most aggressive estimate in the brief they hadn't fully planned for. It did not arrive gradually. It arrived the way a wall arrives, visible from a distance, and then present all at once. And within 4 minutes of the leading edge, reaching the riverbed system, the visibility had dropped to 30 meters and was falling. The helicopter extraction, that had been the primary contingency, was already unavailable. The pilots had been told, and they had diverted to a holding position 70 kilometers north. The team had 6 injured, Pryce with the ribs, 2 others with minor wounds from the firefight, and 3 more with visibility-related injuries from the sudden onset of the storm as they moved. The opposition element had scattered into the outcroppings, which meant they were still present and still armed and operating in terrain they knew well. The team did not know the terrain well. Holt knew it better than anyone else present. She had spent 2 hours the previous night memorizing it. "I have 3 viable positions," she told Lafleur when he came to her in the swirling brown dark that was now the entire world. "2 that give us protection from the south and east, 1 that has a sight line to the vehicle track they came in on." "The vehicle track is blocked," Lafleur said. "Our exfil can't get through in this." "Not yet," she said. "In 40 minutes, the front edge of this system should start to thin. It won't clear, but there'll be a window of reduced density. Maybe 8 minutes. If we're at the right position, and we've suppressed the threat on that track, a vehicle can get through." Lafleur looked at her in the way he had looked at the weather charts the night before. Something moving behind his eyes, the calculation of how much he'd already not listened to and what that had cost. "What do you need?" he said. "Beaumont on my left at 200 meters. Whoever has the cleanest eyes right now on my right at 150. And everyone else consolidated at the 3rd position. Pryce. Pryce stays with the consolidated group. He's mobile enough to provide cover there, and he shouldn't be moving laterally in this." Pryce, 3 meters away in the brown dark, said nothing. His breathing was careful and controlled, the way someone breathes when breathing hurts. He could hear all of it. What happened in the next 40 minutes was the kind of thing that is very difficult to explain to someone who hasn't experienced the particular sensory experience of a full desert dust event. The world contracted. Visibility came and went in waves rather than holding steady, which was both worse and marginally better than a consistent blackout. Worse because it was disorienting, better because it created unpredictable gaps that a trained observer could use. Holt was a trained observer. She moved to the first position by feel and by the topographic map she had internalized the night before. She did not move quickly. She moved in the way she always moved in difficult conditions, which was the way her first instructor had described in a phrase she'd never forgotten, like you're the most expensive piece of equipment on the ground and the ground is trying to break you. At the position she set up, the sight line to the vehicle track was there, intermittent, appearing and disappearing as the dust rolled through in waves. 200 meters to the track. She calculated the wind. There was a direct reading, impossible, but the behavior of the dust itself, the way it moved and where it eddied, gave her enough. She adjusted. At 0658, a figure moved on the track. At 0659, another. They were not exfil, they were the opposition repositioning through the storm using their terrain knowledge, trying to get to the angle that would cut off the team's consolidation point. She took the first shot at 0700, a decision that was also an announcement, and the second at 0701, and she was adjusting for the third when Beaumont's voice came over the radio from her left and said with a kind of exhausted precision that he had the third and fourth. They held the track for 31 minutes. At 0731, the dust began to thin, exactly as she had said it would. At 0739, the extraction vehicles came through. Pryce was in the medical tent when she came back through the wire. She had not expected to speak to him. There was nothing that required it. She was filing her post-action report, and she needed the layout of the vehicle track from Beaumont's observation, and Beaumont was in the medical tent because Pryce was in the medical tent, and that was the only reason she was there. Pryce looked different without the plate carrier. Smaller? Maybe. Not physically. He was still a large man with 17 years of military posture built into his spine. But something in the expression. He was not a man who was accustomed to lying down and having things done to him, and the medical tent had a way of making everyone equal that he had not previously encountered, or had not encountered recently enough to remember. He watched her come in. He watched her speak to Beaumont. He watched her write something in her notebook from what Beaumont told her, and he watched her turn to leave. "Holt," he said. She stopped. She turned. Pryce had the look of a man who had rehearsed something and was now finding that the rehearsed version was wrong. For the moment, he was quiet for long enough that the medical tech attending to his ribs glanced up. "The weather call," he said finally. "You were right. It was not an apology. It was not a comprehensive accounting of the previous 14 days. It was 3 words about one specific thing, and Holt understood it for exactly what it was. The most this particular man knew how to offer, delivered at the first available moment he'd had when she was in the room. She had imagined when she thought about moments like this, and she had thought about moments like this because she was human and she was not above imagining them, that she would feel something sharp and satisfying, a vindication with an edge to it. What she felt instead was tired, tired in a clean way, not an angry way, the kind of tired that comes when something you've been holding is finally set down. Noted, she said. She left the medical tent. Outside, the dust had settled into a fine layer over everything. The vehicles, the tent lines, the wire, the equipment staged near the gate. The western sky was turning a color that was almost ordinary, the dirty orange fading back towards something that might, in another hour, look like a normal late afternoon. Lafleur was outside the tent, leaning against a barrier, looking at the same sky. He had a cup of coffee that had been there long enough that it was probably the temperature of the air. He didn't say anything when Holt came out. He didn't need to. "You're putting me in the brief for the next rotation?" she said. "You were in the brief for this one," he said. "People were just slow to listen. That's one way to put it. You have a better one." She thought about it. She thought about the missing gear and the dropped briefings and the 14 days of weight she'd been carrying around the base. She thought about Pryce's face and the specific flatness of those 3 words. You were right. Delivered like the last of an old debt, insufficient, and also all there was. "Not right now," she said. Lafleur handed her the coffee. She took it. The sky was changing again, back towards something she recognized. To the south, beyond the wire, the desert basin stretched out flat and ancient and entirely indifferent to all of them, to the dust and the firefight and the 40 minutes of careful work that had kept 9 people alive, and to the question of who had seen it coming and who had laughed when she arrived. The basin had seen all of it and would remember none of it. Holt drank the coffee. It was cold. She made a note to submit the full weather analysis to the meteorological unit in Kabul, not because anyone had asked for it, because it was the right data to have on record, and because someone else, on some other rotation, would face the same system building over the same basin, and the note she wrote now might be the thing they pulled when they were trying to decide whether to listen. She wrote it that night, sitting on her cot with her back against the wall, the base settling into the specific quiet that comes after the kind of day that could have ended differently. She wrote it clearly and without drama, the way she did everything. Not to make a point, not to create a record for anyone to revisit with the benefit of hindsight, but simply because the information existed and should not be lost. When she was done, she set down the notebook. She checked her rifle, not because it needed checking, because some habits are not about necessity. Then she turned off the light, and she slept, and in the morning she would be at the briefing table, before Pryce, and before Beaumont, and before anyone else, her notes already organized, already seeing the shape of the next problem, already 3 steps ahead of whatever came next. That was the only answer she had ever needed to give. Not words, not a moment, just that, just the work.